On the morning of August 29th, 1988, a 52-year-old man walked out of his home in the Flatlands section of Brooklyn just after 6 in the morning and started toward his car. It was a short walk, the kind of walk a person makes without thinking, because they have made it countless times before, from the front door to the curb in the early morning quiet of a residential neighborhood where nothing appeared to be happening. He had not yet reached the car when the shooting started. The gunman fired 19 rounds. He was hit once in each thigh, twice in the back, and at least 6 times in the head. He died where he fell. His wife heard the shooting from inside the house and ran out and found him on the pavement and cradled his head in her lap. But there was nothing left to do. His name was Wilfred Johnson. His nickname was Willie Boy. He was 52 years old. He was interred at St. John's Cemetery in Middle Village, Queens. And the story the newspapers carried the following morning was the outline of something far longer than what the outline conveyed. That outline was a man connected to John Gotti, killed in front of his Brooklyn home, a fusillade, a death. What it did not convey was the 19 years that had preceded the fusillade. For 19 years, Wilfred Johnson had operated as a top echelon informant inside the Gambino crime family, feeding intelligence to Federal Bureau of Investigation handlers while maintaining his position in the organization, attending meetings and collecting debts and performing enforcement work while the information he gathered traveled out through his handlers and into federal files and courtrooms. He had done this while remaining, in every visible respect, the closest associate of the man he was most systematically informing against. He had done this without ever agreeing to testify. He had done this until a federal prosecutor, in a single sentence in a public hearing, named him in front of a judge. He was told before that sentence was spoken what it would produce. He had stated clearly what it would produce. He said he would be killed and his family would be slaughtered. He refused to testify anyway. He refused witness protection. He went home. He went back to his neighborhood. He went back to work. He stayed for 3 years. And then the morning came that he had been told would come. The story of how that sentence was spoken, what it destroyed, and what happened in the years between the speaking and the shooting is one of the most complicated and specifically documented double lives in the recorded history of American organized crime. Drop your location in the comments below. It is one of the most genuinely extraordinary parts of doing this. And if you are new here and want more history delivered directly to you, subscribe now. Back to Brooklyn, to the man who spent 19 years inside two worlds that would each, in different ways, cost him everything. Wilfred Johnson was born on September the 29th, 1935, in Canarsie, Brooklyn, the second of 5 children, to a father whose lineage traced back to the Lenape people who had inhabited the territory around New York Harbor before any European arrived to name it, and to an Italian-American mother whose background placed her inside the immigrant working-class world that had built the neighborhoods of southern Brooklyn across 3 generations of newcomers. The family settled in Red Hook, a dense waterfront neighborhood in the southwestern part of the borough, where the connection between the docks and the unions and the criminal organization that controlled both was not something anyone bothered to obscure. His father, John Johnson, was a construction ironworker, a trade that required physical strength and skill, and produced a modest income that his father spent, by every documented account, largely on alcohol. He drank with the consistency and commitment that left nothing over for the people around him. He spent entire paychecks before the family saw any of the money. He beat his wife and his children. His wife, Wilfred's mother, was a woman who stayed and left and came back in the cycle that defined domestic life in a household governed by addiction. The children grew up inside this, 5 of them, in a neighborhood that was not exactly short on alternative models for how to organize a life. What the neighborhood provided as an alternative was the organizational structure that had been accumulating in Red Hook and the surrounding blocks for decades. Helen's Candy Store, a local gathering point, had served as a hangout for Murder, Incorporated, the enforcement arm of the national organized crime syndicate that had operated out of Brooklyn since before the Second World War. The men who moved through a neighborhood like that carried a visible demonstration of what was available to someone with the right combination of physical presence and willingness. Wilfred Johnson was 9 years old when he walked into Helen's and stole money from the register. The arrest that followed was the first entry in a documented record that would grow considerably in the years ahead. At 12, he was in a fight on the school roof and went over the edge, falling from a height that left him with head injuries that produced persistent headaches for the rest of his life. The historical record does not resolve whether the fall was accidental or the result of being pushed. The headaches were real either way, a permanent physical consequence of childhood violence that he carried through every subsequent decade. Before the criminal life absorbed him entirely, he worked as a crane operator, a trade that required physical capability and suggested a particular kind of competence and spatial intelligence. The career of a crane operator was available to him. He did not pursue it for long. The neighborhood pointed in one direction. His household had provided one particular set of tools for navigating the world, and by the time he was in his early teens, he had begun applying those tools to the specific economic structure of the streets around him. By 1949, around age 14, he was running a street-level crew in East New York, Brooklyn, strong-arming people who were behind on debts they owed to men above him. He was, in the vocabulary of that world, collecting. He was built for it in the most literal physical sense. A retired lieutenant from the Queens District Attorney's Squad who encountered him in the years that followed described him in a published memoir as someone you did not want to meet on the street without backup. A man so physically formidable that the first 6 shots might not stop him, the kind of man who, if he got shot, would respond with genuine fury at whoever had done it. His neck measured size 21. His voice was a gravel register that communicated physical consequence without needing to rise above conversational volume. The world that was waiting for him on the other side of that early enforcement work would take him in and give him a role and a name and a permanent position. Because of the blood his father had given him, the world he entered would never give him the one thing that mattered most inside it. His heritage was his ceiling. The rules of the American Mafia required that a man be of full Italian descent on both sides to be formally inducted as a made member. Johnson was half from the wrong half. His father was Lenape, not Italian, and no amount of service or money or demonstrated loyalty could change the arithmetic. He could work for the organization. He could earn for it. He could bleed for it. He could never belong to it in the only sense that carried standing. This was not a rule that had exceptions or that could be negotiated around. It was fixed and absolute, and Johnson understood it from the beginning and entered the organizational world anyway. He went to work. That was what the neighborhood had taught him to do. The Bergen Hunt and Fish Club occupied a pair of connected brick storefronts at 9804 on 101st Avenue in Ozone Park, a neighborhood in the southwestern section of Queens, adjacent to Kennedy Airport and the Aqueduct Racetrack, positioned near the major highway access points that made it useful for the work the club's members actually did. The name had nothing to do with hunting or fishing. The club had a card table and not much else that needed to be visible to the outside world. It had a back section where conversations happened that were not intended for any audience beyond the men in the room. It was nondescript by design, a storefront that could be walked past 1,000 times without a passerby understanding what was being conducted inside. Carmine Fatico ran the crew that operated out of the Bergen. He had moved his base from East New York and Brooklyn to Ozone Park after building his operation in the older neighborhood over many years, and with him came the structure and the money and the men and the obligations of a capo regime in the Gambino crime family, a captain who commanded soldiers and associates and extracted tribute from the territory he controlled and delivered it upward through the hierarchy to the men above him. Fatico was not a young man when Wilfred Johnson entered this world, and his authority over the crew was established and unchallenged in the ways that mattered. Johnson entered through the door that his neighborhood had opened. He was already known in East New York as a man whose physical presence resolved most disagreements before they required further measures. He was already running enforcement work. He collected. He enforced. He made clear to people who were slow with payments what the cost of being slow was. Fatico's crew absorbed him and gave him the role he already knew how to perform. Then, in 1957, something happened that would permanently alter the shape of Johnson's life. He met John Gotti. Gotti was 17 years old when their paths first crossed, a high school dropout from the same East New York world who had already demonstrated that ordinary employment was not going to be his direction. He was quick and ambitious and recognized immediately that the organizational world he saw around him was the one he intended to enter. Fatico saw something in him. When Gotti began building his position in Fatico's crew, Johnson came with him, as he had always been, present, useful, available, positioned behind the man who was rising. The relationship that formed between Gotti and Johnson across the years that followed was not a friendship between equals, and it never became one. Gotti advanced through every stage of the hierarchy that was available to him. Johnson could not advance. Gotti became a capo regime, took over command of the Bergen crew when Fatico was eventually convicted and sent to prison in 1977, and constructed himself into one of the most prominent and eventually the most famous figure in the Gambino family. Johnson ran a modest gambling operation, collected debts, and performed the enforcement work the organization always needed, and watched from the position he had always occupied, close enough to be indispensable, too far outside ever to belong. The derision was regular. Gotti made remarks about redskins and half-breeds that Johnson received without visible response. Gotti's humor did not require his target's participation. Johnson stored the remarks somewhere behind the expression he maintained and continued working. He complained to the handler he would eventually acquire that Gotti was still a mutt underneath the expensive suits, that the smooth exterior was not the man inside it. He noted that Gotti's gambling habit, which ran to bets of as much as $100,000 in a single week, sometimes required action to be laid off at Johnson's bookmaking operation, forcing Johnson to absorb losses from a gambling scale that Gotti produced and Johnson paid. He kept an account of what was owed and what was delivered. The account was not in balance. Salvatore Gravano, who would later become the Gambino family's underboss, and who spent years watching the Gotti-Johnson dynamic from proximity, described it afterward with the directness that characterized his public statements about everything he had witnessed. He said that Johnson had played the loyal subordinate to Gotti's authority, while actually, beneath that performance, taking considerable satisfaction in the position he occupied relative to his handlers. He seethed, Gravano said. The resentment was specific and real. What no one looking at them from the outside could see was what the resentment had produced, or what it was going to produce, or that the most consequential intelligence relationship in the FBI's organized crime investigations of that era was being maintained by a man who walked across the same card table from John Gotti and ran debts for his crew and appeared, to every observer, to be exactly what he was. The appearance was accurate in every visible respect. What it concealed was something else entirely. In the mid-1960s, Wilfred Johnson was convicted of armed robbery and sent to prison. The protocol that governed what happened when a crew member went to prison on behalf of the organization was understood and explicit. Carmine Fatico made a promise. He would provide for Johnson's wife and their 2 infant children while Johnson served his sentence. The family would be taken care of. The man who was incarcerated in the organization's service would not have to worry about what was happening at home. Fatico did not keep this commitment. Johnson's wife, who would remain loyal to him through every prison term he ever served and through everything that followed after, was forced to apply for public assistance. She went on welfare while her husband served time for the organization, whose captain had made a specific promise about exactly this situation. The failure was not ambiguous. It was not a matter of partial support or delayed support. The promise was made, and it was broken, and Johnson's wife sat in a government office and filled out the forms that documented the failure. In 1967, during an FBI interview that was routine in its apparent purpose, an agent noticed something in Johnson's manner that suggested a man who was carrying something unresolved. The reading was accurate. The Bureau's approach, when it came after Johnson's release from prison, was not complicated. They had counterfeiting charges available. Those charges would be dropped if Johnson was willing to talk. Johnson also wanted, in the language of the people who documented the negotiation, to repay the organization for its dishonesty. The two motivations aligned. He agreed, with a condition that was documented in writing, and carried the Bureau's explicit assurance in return. He would never testify under any circumstances, and if his cooperation was ever surfaced, he would deny it entirely. The memo that went into his file stated that he had been given specific assurances on this point. The assurance was the foundational agreement. It was the thing that made every subsequent piece of information he provided possible. Johnson was willing to talk because he trusted that talking would never require him to appear in a courtroom and say it out loud. The moment anyone named him in a courtroom was the moment the arrangement was over and the killing began. He had said this clearly from the start. The Bureau had confirmed the assurance in writing. He was assigned a designation, BQ 5558TE. The BQ stood for Brooklyn, Queens. The TE stood for Top Echelon, the highest classification the informant program carried. His code name was Wahoo, given in reference to his Native American heritage with the casual reductiveness of a bureaucracy, more interested in what he could provide than in the complexity of what he was. His primary handler was Special Agent Martin J. Boland. The method was simple. Johnson would not volunteer. He would answer questions. Boland would submit questions from organized crime squads across the Bureau and from the Drug Enforcement Administration, and Johnson would answer what he chose to answer and leave the rest in place. He was paid almost nothing. The Bureau did not provide regular financial compensation. In one documented transaction, when his information led to the recovery of hijacked goods and an insurance company offered a reward, the FBI provided confidential documentation attesting to his role, and Johnson collected the reward directly. One such recovery produced $30,000. A personal loan of $100 was made by Boland at one point and repaid promptly, with Johnson offering interest that Boland declined. The arrangement was not financial at its core. Its motivation was the one Johnson had stated from the beginning. A debt had been broken, and he intended to settle it. What he would not give the Bureau, despite all the years of direct questions, was a clear and comprehensive account of John Gotti. He had a complicated relationship with the man, one that he described to Boland at one point with the observation that sometimes he loved him and sometimes he hated him. He complained about Gotti's gambling habit and the suits and the derisive remarks. He did not provide the kind of operational detail about Gotti's specific activities that would have built the kind of federal case the Bureau was eventually looking for. When it came to the man across the card table, Johnson was careful in ways he was not careful about other subjects. The exception came in May of 1973. It was the most consequential piece of intelligence he ever produced, and it came not from strategic calculation but from proximity to a man who talked about the things he had done. John Gotti and two associates, Angelo Ruggiero and Ralph Gaglione, walked into a bar on Staten Island in May of 1973 and murdered a man named James McBratney. McBratney had been involved in the kidnapping of a member of the Gambino family, and his death was the organization's response to that action. A waitress at the bar identified Ruggiero and Gaglione. Gotti's identity was not yet connected to the other two, and he went into hiding. Johnson heard Gotti talking about the killing. The information moved from the Bergson through the channel that had been established. The Bureau shared it with the New York City Police Department, and on June 3, 1974, more than a year after the murder, John Gotti was arrested. A notation was placed in Johnson's file. It stated that Johnson had been the sole basis for the apprehension of John Gotti. Johnson was paid $600. Gotti eventually pleaded guilty to a reduced charge of attempted manslaughter and was sent to Greenhaven Correctional Facility in Dutchess County. Johnson was at Greenhaven, too. He was serving time on an armed robbery conviction. The two men who had sat across card tables from each other since 1957 were now in the same institution, one of them having put the other there and the other not knowing it. Johnson's secret held through those shared walls. The accounting he had been keeping had produced its most concrete result, and it had produced it in a way that remained entirely invisible to the person most affected by it. He served his time. Gotti served his. They were released at separate intervals and returned to the Bergen and the world that had always been theirs. The McBratney case was the highest profile item Johnson produced in his informant career, but it was not the full picture of what 19 years of source wahoo had generated. In 1978, he told his handler where Paul Vario, a capo regime in the Lucchese family, was operating his hijacking headquarters. The location was a scrapyard owned by a man named Clyde Brooks, and what made the information particularly valuable was an accompanying detail. Johnson also explained how Vario's crew had been avoiding FBI surveillance. They were using a parked trailer in a Brooklyn junkyard as their meeting space, a location that fell outside the parameters of any active monitoring operation. The identification of that trailer produced the surveillance access the Bureau had been trying to establish. He reported on the Pleasant Avenue Connection, a large-scale heroin distribution network that operated out of East Harlem and involved figures connected to the Gambino family and others, providing intelligence on its operations and personnel that contributed to the federal investigation of one of the most significant narcotics networks in New York during that period. In 1979, he provided information about the disappearance of Anthony Plate, a Della Croce associate who had operated a loan sharking operation in Miami and whose continued existence had become a problem for Della Croce before a significant legal proceeding. Plate walked out of a Miami Beach hotel one August morning and was never seen again. Shortly afterward, Gotti, Angelo Ruggiero, and Johnson all appeared at the Bergen with deep tans. Johnson told his handler what he knew about what had happened. He also helped the Bureau gain access to Angelo Ruggiero's private communications. He described the layout of Ruggiero's home in sufficient detail for agents to position listening equipment. He told his handler that Ruggiero was using his daughter's telephone for conversations he considered secure. Having mentioned this to Johnson directly, the FBI tapped the line. What the recordings captured would eventually help build a narcotics case against John Gotti, Ruggiero, and others, and would generate the demand from Gambino boss Paul Castellano for transcripts that Ruggiero refused to provide, producing the internal organizational crisis that contributed to Castellano's assassination in December of 1985. The thread from Johnson's specific intelligence about a telephone line ran, through a sequence of documented events, to one of the most consequential murders in the recent history of New York organized crime. And then in December of 1981, Johnson acquired a second handler at a second agency, through a transaction that began with his own arrest. New York City Police Department detectives observed what appeared to be a drug exchange. Johnson handed a package to someone and received a paper bag in return, then drove to his Brooklyn home. When the detectives approached as he opened his trunk, the bag held $50,000. Johnson, still on probation from an earlier sentence, was arrested for attempted bribery when he offered the money to the officers. The subsequent arrangement was sealed. The $50,000 went to the police pension fund. The indictment was not pursued, and Johnson began providing information to the NYPD. His first significant tip was the location of the body of Bonanno family, Capo Alphonse Indelicato, who had been killed in the internal warfare of that year. He did not tell the FBI about the NYPD. He did not tell the NYPD about the FBI. He was running two simultaneous relationships with two separate law enforcement agencies, answering questions from both in the same period, and neither agency knew the other existed in Johnson's operational life. He was the most consequential organized crime source in the FBI's New York operations and a productive informant for the NYPD at the same time, and the two institutions sharing a city were drawing from the same man without knowing it. Diane Giacalone had grown up in Ozone Park, Queens, within walking distance of the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club. She had walked past it as a young woman, absorbing the presence of the men who used it as a command center in the way that anyone who grew up in that particular neighborhood absorbed the organizational facts of the block they lived on. She had eventually become an assistant United States attorney in the Eastern District of New York, and in late 1984 she began building a RICO case, against John Gotti and the members of his crew that would become the first major federal prosecution of the man who had emerged as the most publicly prominent figure in American organized crime. The FBI's Gambino squad, under Supervisory Special Agent Bruce Mao, was simultaneously building its own case against Gotti using a different approach, and the relationship between the two investigative efforts was adversarial from the beginning. Mao's squad believed Giacalone's case was premature and that her central strategy for extracting testimony was going to cause damage that extended well beyond the immediate prosecution. They were specifically and explicitly concerned about what she planned to do with Wilfred Johnson. Her plan was to expose him. She would reveal his informant status in a public proceeding, placing him in a position where he would either agree to testify against Gotti in exchange for the protection of the Witness Protection Program, or face the consequences of being publicly identified as a government source to the very men he had been informing against for 19 years. The logic was that the exposure itself would motivate cooperation. The FBI understood this logic differently. It understood the exposure as a fundamental breach of the institutional promise that made the informant program function. Senior Bureau officials, including Thomas Scheer and James Kostler, brought the case to the Eastern District of New York. They made the argument that naming Johnson in a public proceeding would destroy the confidence of every active source the Bureau was running by demonstrating that the government's most basic assurance, the assurance that a top echelon informant would never be surfaced, was not actually binding. The argument was overruled. Eastern District United States Attorney Raymond Deary supported Giacalone. The FBI's opposition counted for nothing against the prosecutorial authority of the office bringing the case. On March 18, 1985, Johnson's handler Abbott and his supervisor met with Giacalone and handed over the source Wahoo files. She planned to turn these files over voluntarily to defense attorneys before they were formally requested. The agents asked why she would not at least wait until the files were demanded through the discovery process. She told them she was sorry and proceeded. Abbott then told Johnson what was coming. Johnson's response was precise and immediate. If this happened, he said, he would be killed and his family would be slaughtered. He did not say this as a theoretical possibility. He said it as the certainty he had carried inside the arrangement from the day he agreed to it. The specific consequence that every assurance and every written commitment and every documented memo had been designed to prevent. Abbott advised him to plead guilty, to testify, and to enter the Witness Protection Program. Johnson refused. He had refused before. He refused again. The condition he had set in the beginning, the thing the assurance had been constructed to honor, had been that he would never testify. He was not going to revise the condition now because the people who had promised to protect it had decided not to. 1 week later, on March the 25th, 1985, his name appeared on a federal indictment alongside John Gotti, Gene Gotti, Neil Dellacroce, Dellacroce's son Armand, Charles Carneglia, John Carneglia, Anthony Rampino, Nicholas Carrazzo, and Leonard DeMaria. 10 defendants charged with 2 RICO counts, racketeering and conspiracy, carrying potential sentences of 40 years in prison and fines of $50,000 per count. On March 28th, at 4 o'clock in the morning, New York City police detectives and Drug Enforcement Administration agents arrived at the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club. Gotti, Gene Gotti, and Johnson were inside playing cards. They were arrested and removed. 7 of the 10 defendants were arraigned in the days that followed. Johnson was the last. He stood before Judge Eugene Nickerson in a federal courtroom in Brooklyn, the only defendant in the room at the moment Giacalone spoke. She told the judge that Johnson should be held without bail because no conditions of release could ensure his appearance, and she gave the reason. Johnson had been an informant for the Federal Bureau of Investigation for a period of over 15 years, and his life would be in danger if he were released. Johnson was on his feet before the defense table. His fists had clenched so tight that the words tattooed across his knuckles, the word true on one hand and the word love on the other, showed their outlines against the white tension of his skin. He told the court that what Giacalone had said was not true. Giacalone then referenced the specific exchange in which Johnson had told his handler that he and his family would be slaughtered if this happened. The judge took her point. Johnson was ordered held without bail. He was transported to the Metropolitan Correctional Center, the federal detention facility in Lower Manhattan. What awaited him was not standard pretrial detention. The facility placed him in special housing that confined him to his cell for 23 and a half hours out of every 24. His access to showers was restricted. His access to recreation was restricted. A glass door to his housing area allowed other inmates to observe him and taunt him with the information the arraignment had made public. When his lawyers came to meet with him, he was led to them in leg shackles. When his wife arrived for a scheduled visit on Easter Sunday, she was turned away at the door. His lawyers filed motions characterizing the conditions as cruel and inhumane, arguing that the purpose was not security, but coercion, and that the coercion was Giacalone's attempt to force him into cooperation by making the alternative intolerable. The motions produced hearings, and no relief. Johnson spent 16 months in that section while pretrial proceedings moved at their institutional pace. The FBI, meanwhile, had formally withdrawn from the Gotti prosecution. The Bureau cited what it described as administrative and procedural differences. What those words meant in operational practice was that the FBI considered the surfacing of source Wahoo a violation of the foundational principles of the Informant program and was not prepared to continue supporting a prosecution built on that foundation. A year after the initial arrests, Giacalone moved to have Gotti's own bail revoked. She argued before Judge Nickerson that Gotti had been involved in the intimidation of a witness named Romuald Pichik in a separate assault case, and that this conduct made him a threat to the proceedings. The judge agreed. Gotti was sent to the Metropolitan Correctional Center to a floor above Wilfred Johnson. The meeting between them that followed is documented through the account that Salvatore Gravano gave years later, after he turned state's evidence in an entirely different case. Gravano was not present on the ninth floor. He was the person to whom Gotti described what had happened there, and his account of that description is the primary record available. Gotti told Johnson, in Gravano's account of what Gotti said, that he had done a bad thing for all those years, that he would be forgiven for it, that it was not the first time something of this kind had occurred, that he could never return to the organization after the case was resolved, that nothing would happen to him. Johnson heard this and asked for something specific. He asked Gotti to swear on the head of his dead son. Frank Gotti, 12 years old, had been struck and killed by a car in the neighborhood in March of 1980, driven by a neighbor named John Favara, and the loss was the most permanent thing Gotti carried. For Johnson, it was the only oath that could carry the weight the moment required. The most unreachable thing, sworn on. Gotti swore. Johnson never testified. Gravano's summary of the encounter was direct. He said that Gotti had completely deceived Johnson, that he did not understand how Johnson had fallen for it, and that Johnson had fallen for it entirely, lock, stock, and barrel. The trial that followed was, in many respects, the prosecution that the FBI had predicted would fail when it withdrew. Jury selection began in August of 1986. The defense was led by attorneys Bruce Cutler and Barry Slotnick for Gotti, who dismantled the prosecution's three cooperating witnesses, James Cardinale, Salvatore Polisi, and Matthew Traynor, by establishing with considerable specificity that each had personal reasons for testifying that made their accounts unreliable. The jury was also compromised. A juror named George Pape, a friend of organized crime figure Bosko Radonjic, was bribed for $60,000 through an arrangement that passed through Radonjic to Gravano. Gotti entered the final phase of the trial knowing that he had, at minimum, a hung jury regardless of what the evidence showed. The trial ended on Friday, March 13th, 1987. All 7 defendants were found not guilty. Johnson was separately caught arranging a heroin deal over the telephone from his detention unit, pleaded guilty, and was sentenced to 1 year, which he had already served during the proceedings. He was released. That afternoon, the complete source Wahoo files were formally delivered to Gotti's defense attorneys. The files established, in the Bureau's own documentation, precisely what Johnson had provided across 19 years. They confirmed that he had been, as the notation stated, the sole basis for Gotti's arrest in the McBratney case in 1974. They confirmed that his intelligence had contributed to the narcotics case against John Gotti and Angelo Ruggiero that had produced the internal crisis with Castellano. They confirmed the parallel NYPD arrangement. They documented in the systematic detail of 19 years of filed intelligence reports the full extent of what had passed from inside the Bergen outward to the Bureau. Gotti read what was in those files. His defense attorneys read what was in those files. The scope of what Johnson had provided, documented in the Bureau's own language over 2 decades, was now in the possession of the man against whom most of it had eventually been directed. Johnson was banned from the Bergen. He returned to Brooklyn and took a construction job, living with his wife in Flatlands. He was reportedly involved in some drug activity in the period that followed, though the documentary record does not establish the specific details of this. He was a man who knew one world and could not conceive of himself outside it, and he returned to that world even after the world had every reason to end him. In the summer of 1988, according to accounts documented in the research into this period, Johnson had reportedly passed along information about activities connected to Alphonse Persico, the son of imprisoned Colombo family boss Carmine Persico. The Persico family had their own concerns about Johnson's ongoing access to information that affected their affairs. A challenge was reportedly directed at the Gambino family. The specific question attributed to Alphonse Persico was a pointed one, asking what was being waited for. Gotti discussed the situation with Gravano. His expressed concern was specific and tactical. A failed assassination attempt would push Johnson into witness protection, where he would be available to testify about everything the files had documented and more, in a context where the Bureau and the prosecution would be able to make full use of what he said. The concern was rational. Johnson alive and protected and testifying was a different category of threat from Johnson living quietly in Brooklyn on the strength of an oath sworn on a dead child's name. The contract was assigned to Eddie Lino, a former Bonanno family associate who had been among the shooters at the Castellano assassination and who had connections across the organized crime world that extended beyond any single family's lines. Lino routed the assignment through an intermediary, and it eventually reached Bonanno family gunmen. Thomas Patera, known in those circles as Tommy Karate, and Vincent Giacalone, known as Kojak, were among the men who arrived in the Flatlands section of Brooklyn before 6 in the morning on August 29, 1988. Johnson was 52 years old. That morning was his birth month. He had been born on September 29th, exactly 1 month later. The walk from his front door to his car was the same walk he had made every day in the neighborhood he had never permanently left. At 6:05 in the morning, he came out of his front door. The gunman fired 19 rounds. The wound documentation established afterward matched the pattern of a professional execution. Once in each thigh, twice in the back, at least 6 times in the head. He died where he stood. The hit team dropped caltrops on the street behind them as they withdrew, metal spike devices designed to flatten tires and prevent vehicular pursuit. They left. Johnson's wife heard the shooting from inside the house. She ran out and found him on the pavement in front of the house and sat beside him there on the concrete of a Brooklyn street at 6 in the morning, cradling his head in her lap the way she had waited for him and stayed for him through every year of what the arrangement they had built together had cost. The New York Times reported the following morning on the killing of a man connected to John Gotti, slain on a Brooklyn street. The investigation that followed identified the shooters within the organized crime investigative community. In 1992, Patera and Giacalone were tried for the murder. Giacalone was found guilty. Patera was acquitted in Johnson's case, but was separately convicted of 6 other murders and sentenced to spend the rest of his life in federal prison. In 1991, in a separate proceeding, Patera had accused Johnson of having been the gunman who killed John Favara, the neighbor whose car had struck Gotti's son, Frank, in March of 1980. Favara had disappeared the following summer and his body was never recovered. The historical record does not establish this claim definitively in either direction. What the record does note is that Johnson's FBI files had contained no information about the Favre disappearance, a gap that stood out against an otherwise detailed account of Gambino family violence. Wilfred Johnson is buried at St. John's Cemetery in Middle Village, Queens. What his story ultimately reveals is the structure of triple betrayal that is unusual even within a world built on betrayal as a fundamental operating principle, and that carries its own specific logic from beginning to end. The first betrayal was the organization's. Carmine Fatico promised to support Johnson's family when Johnson went to prison in the organization's service. Fatico did not keep the promise. The failure was specific and documented and not ambiguous. The wife went on welfare, the children were without support, and the man who had made the commitment did not make it good. In the world that defined the exchange of obligations as the primary currency of every relationship, this was the foundational failure. Johnson drew his accounting from it and made his response. The second betrayal was Johnson's own. For 19 years, he provided intelligence about the operations of the family he served to federal agents, who used it to make arrests, build cases, and disrupt the organizational structure of the Gambino crime family. He did this while sitting at the same tables and collecting the same debts and absorbing the same derisive remarks as before. He identified the location of John Gotti after a murder. He contributed to the narcotics investigation that produced a confrontation between Gotti and Castellano that contributed conditions leading to Castellano's death. He ran two parallel informant relationships simultaneously and disclosed neither to the other agency. In the moral arithmetic of the world he occupied, what he did was the most serious violation available. He did it for 19 years. The third betrayal was the government's. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had given Johnson a specific written assurance. He would never be surfaced. He would never be asked to testify. If surfaced, he would be allowed to deny. The institutional promise was documented, confirmed, and foundational to everything Johnson had provided. Diane Giacalone's decision to name him in a public hearing, to hand his files voluntarily to defense attorneys before they were formally requested, to place him before a judge and state his informant status as grounds for detention, destroyed in a single courtroom sentence what 19 years of careful management had protected. The FBI had tried to stop her. Senior officials had made the case to the Eastern District. The case was overruled. The promise was broken by the institution that had made it. Johnson had predicted the consequence with precision. He was right. The most quietly remarkable feature of the 3 years between the hearing and the shooting is what Johnson chose to do during them. He did not testify. He did not enter witness protection. He did not leave. He was a man who understood exactly what his exposure meant, and who chose to return to the only world he knew anyway, on the strength of an oath that the man who swore it did not intend to keep. He had asked for the one thing in the world that Gotti could not give back, and he had accepted it, and he had gone home. Whether this was loyalty or something else, a specific stubbornness or an inability to conceive of himself in any other identity, the available documentation does not resolve. What it resolves is the choice and the consequence. John Gotti was convicted in 1992 on charges that included 5 murders and died in a federal prison medical facility in Missouri in June of 2002. The FBI's case against him, the patient and carefully constructed case that Mao's squad had been building when Giacalone's prosecution created the conflict that ended in Johnson's exposure, eventually succeeded. The approach that the Bureau had argued should replace Giacalone's, the one that used recordings, and the testimony of Salvatore Gravano, produced the conviction that the Giacalone case had failed to produce. The informant that Johnson had bled to protect was convicted anyway, 3 years after Johnson was dead, by a method that Johnson's silence had never been designed to prevent. Wilfred Johnson spent 19 years feeding a machine he never publicly acknowledged. He was named in a courtroom in March of 1985 and was dead in the street in August of 1988. He was buried at St. John's Cemetery in Middle Village, Queens. The Bergen Hunt and Fish Club on 100 First Avenue in Ozone Park, where he played cards in the early hours and ran enforcement for the crew and sat across from the man he had put in federal prison for $600, was eventually converted into two separate commercial spaces. The organization he informed on and refused to testify against kept operating after his death, and after Gotti's conviction and through the years that followed. Whether that was the outcome he would have chosen, the documentation does not say. It says only that he chose the walk on that particular morning, and that what was waiting at the end of it was exactly what he had said it would be.